Alright, hello guys, welcome to the second unpredicted part of this composition tutorial. I'd meant to initially just talk about focal points as really one whole of the whole composition subject, but then I realized in my breakdown that I done at the very beginning that really doesn't make a lot of sense not to talk about the shapes that are being filled with contrast. So again, if we break down the whole topic of making images, just to reiterate, there's really two aspects to it. There's the two-dimensional flat plane, which consists of these shapes here, and there's the three-dimensional, which consists of you trying to create an illusion of depth on a flat plane. And now these shapes are filled with different colors that generate different types of contrast. So value, saturation, hue, contrast, and so on. But uh, you know, I need to talk about how you actually want to order and place these shapes in the picture plane to achieve your desired result. And the whole previous video was really focusing and based on contrast as the primary um, principle. And this is true to some extent with shape design as well, although there will be some slightly different principles that I'll touch on that are not necessarily all just completely hinging and orbiting around contrast. So let's just get started here. And another caveat before I actually get started here is that when I talk about shapes like this, I'm speaking about them in the context of composition or like a full image ordering rather than necessarily about designing a creature or a character or drawing really for that matter. So I think I could do a separate video just breaking down the way that I think about shapes in characters primarily, maybe even creatures, and then I could do a demo there. And it's a lot more difficult to do a demo for a composition video because all of the principles that I'm talking about are very abstract. But regardless, let's just get into it. And so, initially, the question that you want to ask yourself when it comes to shapes is quite simply what kind of shapes you want to use. And the conventional rule that bears repeating is that you usually want to keep your shapes grouped in a way, or you want to echo your shape, or you want to repeat your shape. And what that means is really that within an image you want to have generally a primary shape that repeats. Now if you look at this image here, and I'm going to be using my images as examples for all of these principles again, which might not be the best because I do more characters than full images, but whatever. If you look at this image, the whole design that we have going on is just a bunch of triangles and sharp shapes, right? And if you look at this character, which you think could be interesting because it's not a full composition, but still has the same principle, we also have a bunch of similar shapes, in this case squares or blocky shapes repeating. Now, when it comes to this principle of repeating shape, you don't, of course, have to obsess about it, and you also don't have to limit yourself. And what I mean by that is that when it comes to you repeating a primary shape, it doesn't necessarily have to be a simple shape like this. It could be a more complex shape. So I don't know, you could use a crescent, for example, which is a modified circle, or you could use a curved triangle, or you can use a tapering block. So you could base your shape design something like this, or alternatively, what you can do is use a more abstract element of shape. And what I mean by that is that instead of necessarily using like a trapezoid shape or a completely squared shape, you can use blocky shapes in general, right? So even though this has a different quality than this, and this is slightly curved here, right? It all still follows generally a certain blockiness. And in some places it's more obvious, in some places less so. And in this case as well, all of the shapes have sort of a vertical nature to them, and they're pretty sharp. So if you look at the character, if you look at the boat, the rocks are quite obvious, but all of them are going up this way, and they're vaguely triangular. And you know, this triangle is clearly different than this triangle, and these shapes are curved, they're not necessarily vertical, but they all have a general tie-in, a general characteristic that holds them together, right? So you don't have to necessarily be literal about this, and you don't have to limit yourself to simple shapes either. And this is the first idea that you ought to think about when it comes to placing your shapes in a composition is what would be the tying element, what is going to be your primary shape or your primary characteristic of your shapes that will help sort of give a cohesion. But then an idea that sort of stems from this and that actually ties in pretty closely to all of the contrast stuff that I was talking about in the first video is the use of an accent shape. And an accent shape is quite simply just a shape that has different characteristics, so it's different and thereby creating contrast, and it's used to attract attention. So you usually want to have, and you can call it a secondary shape either, you usually want to have some areas of the image that don't necessarily adhere to your shape echoing. And now of course you want to have most of the image, like 70% of the image, be coherent and tied in with one shape, and then maybe 30% with another, and this 30% will be the accent or the focal points in terms of shape. And again, this is kind of separate from value and color. We're just talking about shape focal points here without any added value. So in this case, if you look at the breakdown, even though there is some curve to some of the rest shape, the other shapes around here, the thing that stands out as a different shape is this swirly shape here, and it stands out in the silhouette as well, right there, and also the tails. So even though most of the image is quite, or most of the design that is quite blocky, there are still these curved parts that hopefully attract attention on the shape level. And a similar thing happens here with the curved areas there and there, and you know, these guys actually don't really adhere to the sharpness at all, and the main character does, but because they're different, hopefully they would stand out in just shape, at the shape level only. Now sadly I'm not really happy with the values here, so the values really don't help with the readability and with showing these shapes and their different nature, but at least I tried, and this is the principle that you would want to try to achieve. Of course it's not always going to be successful, but this is the primary thing to think about, is like what your shapes are before you even start putting them down. And then the next thing to consider is how they relate. Now this is still a relationship, of course, they are related in their character, but this is a question of how they relate in size. And everybody's heard about big, medium, small. Another way to call this would be size variety. And the idea is, if you have a shape that repeats, which you would usually, if you're thinking about this principle, you would have, then you want to ask yourself how that shape repeats. And the intention here is to not have it repeat too literally, so that the organic effect that we are usually trying to achieve with composition is lost. So the way to do that is quite simply to just have shapes that are obviously of different sizes, and big, medium, small is just a good kind of stand-in for that idea. And what it means really is that one shape ought to be clearly different in size. So if you look at these blocks, which are quite a good example because they're very abstract, one shape is clearly different than another. And I think this is actually a good example of kind of a failed big, medium, small, because you know, I was thinking about, if you look at these shapes, I was thinking about as this as a big, right? And so, you know, that is quite big, and then this should be like the medium, and this should be the small. But if you look at the big and the medium, they're very similar. And if you look at them, you know, overlapping, that is true. And then if you look at their actual shapes here, that is kind of true as well, right? So what I would have preferred maybe is to at least have the medium here slightly smaller, and perhaps I could have this slightly larger. And now their relationship is more clear, and this could be even smaller, I think, just a little bit, so that still, you know, pushes that idea. In here I think it's a little bit more successful, where, you know, this is clearly big, it's very large, this is medium, this is small, and then it starts repeating again. So the idea is to have a clear size distinction between elements of same shape. Often they will be the same element. You know, these blocks are the same thing, but they also have the same shape. Same here. On the largest scale, so on the scale of the whole image, when we're talking about just the biggest shapes that we're working with here, or on the smaller scale, and you can go infinitely zooming in, but hopefully the big shapes adhere to this principle, and then the smaller shapes within those adhere to that principle as well. So if we look at the monastery here, we have a big, a medium, and a small, which could have been smaller still, because these two are kind of similar. And if we look at some of the breakdowns, you know, for example, this, I don't really like so much. Again, as here, the distinction could be more clear. So, you know, my whatever this is, my texture could go around here and separate this shape further into a small and a big, and maybe you could have a tiny one as well, so that we would have small, big, medium. But whenever you're breaking down your shapes that you have already established that have big, medium, small, you should still be thinking about big, medium, small, and trying not to split things evenly in half, either vertically or horizontally. And as you can see here with these examples, they don't follow the principle to a T, but they're still somewhat successful, you know. And of course this image is about the character, so this is not so important, but this image is not. It's about the shapes, and it still works. So you don't have to, you know, even on this smaller scale, the stuff that I'm talking about, these smaller details, so you don't have to obsess about this, but you should think about it consciously initially. And at the start, when you're just getting the hang of the principle, you should actually kind of obsess about it. But then later, when it becomes more second nature, you don't have to obsess about it, because you already have this way of thinking. But before you have like a natural way of thinking about big, medium, small, you should try to think about it consciously. And then later on, even if you notice that something is a little bit off, like what I have here with, you know, this being maybe 40 and 60, whereas it would be better if it was 30 and 70, you can still let it slide. So that's the principle of big, medium, small. And just to reiterate again, you want to have big, medium, small in your in the relationship of the shapes that repeat. And when you break those shapes down even further, and you know, this can go to a micro level, you should still think about having this relationship. And another thing to keep in mind as well is that if you are somehow not able to do it, or to do it entirely in full scale, so what I mean by that is, or maybe better way of saying that would be, if you're unable to do it in shape, you know, relationship, in size relationship like this, you can still try to do it in a dimension. So you can still try to have big, medium, small in height, or big, medium, small in width, right? And so this is an example of that, where there is a bit of a taper, but when we're breaking this shape down, we're not going to be having different shapes necessarily entirely within it. We're just breaking it down vertically like this. And so when you're thinking about that dimension, you still want to think about having a big and a small portion, and you know, that could be enough, or you can have a big, medium, and a small portion. But you don't necessarily have to think about these shapes as literally separate shapes that have different sizes, but you can think about, as you break a shape down, it can have different sizes within it, and as you design a shape, it can have different dimensions, or it should have different dimensions generally in it, in order to feel organic. So if we're talking about this block here, if we want to make it feel organic, we want to have, let's say, a big, a small, and a medium. So this feels a lot more organic than this. This feels very uniform and man-made. And I think this is a good example of sort of the whole principle being applied at a very, very abstract scale. And what this shows you is that big, medium, small really is intended to create an organic effect. And it is touted as a very important universal principle, because in almost all cases, you actually want to have an organic effect, because what you see in reality feels organic. But if you do have an intention to create something that feels man-made or rigid or uniform, you can actually just disregard this principle entirely. But those would be rare cases, and they would be exceptional. So that is the part on how you actually want to relate the sizes of the shapes, the similar shapes that you have created. And then Finally, I want to talk about another way of relating them, which is sort of how they would be placed in the actual image to create movement between them, really, to sort of tie them and link them together. So I think this is a good example of that. Where, and actually, let's break it down first, because I want to keep breaking things down very abstractly in order to I think better explain these principles, because at some level you need to think about them very abstractly, and then later on when you work you can think about them a little bit more concretely. But when talking about gesture or movement, you can sort of break it down as a long axis of whatever shape you have. So if you have a shape like this, its gesture will not be going this way around it, but it will be going through it. So your gesture at its core is really just a movement through the long axis of a shape, and if that shape has a taper or a point to it, that will direct the movement. But that's all there is to it. And so if I have a shape like this, it's going to be clearly moving this way, and if I have a shape like this, it would hopefully be clear that it's moving the other way. But in both cases the movement is through the long axis. So if you look at the shapes that I have here, and if I break them down, you'll see that what happens with this image is that you have one movement going this way, one movement going this way, so sort of starting like a zigzag here, and then a big curve through this whole shape, and including this as well. So they're moving there into an accent focal point and a straight vertical that limits the movement. So if we kind of follow the eye through the image and think about what is intended to happen, you ought to see the image, or the viewer ought to see it start moving this way. Maybe not necessarily start moving that way, maybe they would actually start moving at the at the focal point, but regardless, they would travel through the image in this path, going zigzagging and then coming around, seeing this, and then stopping and coming back, right? So when it comes to thinking about gesture as an element of composition, the question is, and the intention is to be clear about how the viewer's vision will travel through the image. And if we look at this example here, which is a lot more simple, because there's really just one blob of two characters and a bit of environment, there is still a strong gesture kind of coming around and serving to not let the viewer wander out away from the image. And what is good for that often is either a curve like this, sort of working as a frame, or a straight like that. And dark shapes usually work pretty well for the intention of stopping movement. But within the area where the eyes ought to move, you should think about how your shapes, or really how their long axes, add up into a pattern that will often be a zigzag in like an illustration context. So if you look at something like this, really the way that I intended for this to work, or for the viewer to perceive it, is, or to move through it, is literally in a zigzag like this and then come back around, right? Because the cape moves like that, the tail is a very obvious element guiding the eye, and then hopefully the tails and the body's gesture here would move into this big curve, and then at this point it becomes a little bit less important. But this is a clear kind of closed shape, so you would hopefully move, since there are no important elements here, you would hopefully just move back in. And there are some sort of rim elements that would hopefully stop you, these vertical elements that would stop you from wandering off. And there is a lack of strong asymmetry, which means that if I had ordered the wolf this way and I placed the head like this and maybe had the hand leaning, then you might be led to go outside. But since it's more symmetrical, the movement just zigzags and then comes back around. And when I was making this image, I had a clear and conscious intention of doing that. So I think that about covers everything that I wanted to talk about here. It's not very extensive, but I think these are the very most important things. And just to reiterate again, keeping your shapes tied in and coherent by using a primary shape. That doesn't necessarily have to be a literal geometric shape, but it can be a more complex or a more abstract characteristic of a shape, and then using a secondary or an accent shape to create shape contrast, ordering your shapes in a big, medium, small pattern if you intend to have an organic effect, which you most often will, and then ordering your shapes or stacking them in such a way that their long axes create a movement or a gesture through the whole image that doesn't go outside of the image but is somehow stopped and limited or constrained within the image, and so you have to have an element that brings the eye back around. And that about covers that, I think. So if you have any questions regarding this, you can leave them in the comments, and you can also always leave some topic suggestions that you might have, and you can also comment on the quality of my my microphone, because I just bought a new mic. Well, I didn't buy a new mic, but I bought parts for it, and I still have a bit of experimenting to do to set it up properly, because the angle is kind of wonky, and I probably don't know how to utilize the parts too well yet, but this is the creamy ASMR part. So yeah, thanks guys for supporting, and have a good day.